Chapter 1 Introduction. In the opening chapter of Talking to Strangers, Gladwell sets the stage for his exploration of the challenges of communication by introducing the case of Sandra Bland, a young African-American woman who was arrested and subsequently died in police custody in Texas in 2015. Gladwell argues that Bland's tragic death was the result of a fundamental mismatch between her expectations and the behavior of the police officer who pulled her over, and that this mismatch is a common and pervasive problem in human interactions. Key insights. People often rely on default to truth as a default setting in their interactions with others, assuming that others are telling the truth unless there is evidence to the contrary. However, this default setting can lead people to overlook warning signs or red flags that might indicate that someone is lying or behaving in a deceptive or harmful way. This can be particularly dangerous in situations where there is a power imbalance, such as interactions between police officers and civilians. Actionable steps. Be aware of your own biases and assumptions when interacting with others. Don't assume that everyone is telling the truth or has your best interests at heart. Look for signs of deception or suspicious behavior, such as inconsistencies in someone's story or body language that doesn't match what they are saying. If you are in a position of authority or power, be aware of the potential for abuse of that power and take steps to ensure that you are not using your position to harm others. Chapter 2 Fidel Castro's Revenge. In Chapter 2, Gladwell tells the story of the Cuban spy Ana Montes, who worked for the United States government for many years before being exposed as a double agent for the Cuban government. Gladwell uses Montes' story to illustrate the concept of coupling, which refers to the idea that certain behaviors or traits are inherently linked to others and cannot be understood or predicted in isolation. Key insights. Human behavior is complex and multifaceted, and it can be difficult to predict or understand why people do what they do. The concept of coupling helps to explain why seemingly unrelated factors can be connected and influence each other. In the case of Ana Montes, her betrayal of the United States government was coupled with her deep-seated political beliefs and her personal relationship with a Cuban intelligence officer. Actionable steps. Recognize that human behavior is often influenced by a range of factors, including personality traits, social context, and personal history. Be aware of your own tendencies and patterns of behavior, and try to understand why you might be behaving in a certain way. When trying to understand someone else's behavior, look for clues that might reveal their motivations and context, rather than assuming that their behavior is completely random or inexplicable. Chapter 3 A Default to Truth. In Chapter 3, Gladwell explores the idea of transparency and how it can lead to misunderstandings and misinterpretations in human interactions. He uses the case of Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister who famously declared peace for our time after negotiating with Adolf Hitler in 1938, to illustrate how transparency can be misleading and dangerous when dealing with people who are deceptive or manipulative. Key insights. Transparency refers to the idea that people are generally open and honest about their thoughts, feelings, and intentions. However, this assumption can lead to misunderstandings and misinterpretations when dealing with people who are deceptive or manipulative. In the case of Neville Chamberlain, his belief that Hitler was being transparent and honest about his intentions led him to make a deal that ultimately led to the outbreak of World War II. Actionable steps. Be aware of the potential for deception and manipulation in human interactions, and don't assume that everyone is being completely transparent and honest. Look for clues that might indicate that someone is not being truthful or has ulterior motives, such as inconsistencies in their story or behavior that doesn't match their words. When negotiating with others, be prepared to walk away if you feel that the other party is not being transparent or honest about their intentions. Context and examples. In Chapter 1, Gladwell uses the case of Sandra Bland to illustrate how a mismatch in expectations and behavior can lead to tragic outcomes. Bland was pulled over by a police officer for a minor traffic violation, but the encounter quickly escalated, and she was arrested and subsequently died in police custody. Gladwell argues that the police officer's behavior was not necessarily malicious, but rather the result of a mismatch in expectations between him and Bland. He expected her to comply with his commands without question, while she expected him to treat her with respect and follow proper procedures. This mismatch ultimately led to a breakdown in communication and a tragic outcome. In Chapter 2, Gladwell tells the story of Ana Montes, a Cuban spy who worked for the United States government for many years before being exposed as a double agent. Montes' story illustrates the concept of coupling, as her betrayal of the United States government was coupled with her deep-seated political beliefs and her personal relationship with a Cuban intelligence officer. Gladwell argues that understanding this coupling is essential to understanding why Montes did what she did, and that it highlights the complexity of human behavior. In Chapter 3, Gladwell uses the example of Neville Chamberlain to illustrate how transparency can be misleading and dangerous when dealing with people who are deceptive or manipulative. Chamberlain believed that Hitler was being transparent and honest about his intentions, and this belief led him to make a deal that ultimately led to the outbreak of World War II. Gladwell argues that this example highlights the importance of recognizing the potential for deception and manipulation in human interactions, and not assuming that everyone is being completely transparent and honest. Chapter 4, Transparency. In Chapter 4, Gladwell continues his exploration of transparency and its limitations in human interactions. He uses the example of Sylvia Plath, the American poet who committed suicide in 1963, to illustrate how people can hide their true feelings and intentions, even when they appear to be completely transparent. Key insights. Transparency can be misleading when dealing with people who are experiencing deep emotional pain or distress. In the case of Sylvia Plath, she appeared to be transparent and open about her struggles with mental illness and suicidal thoughts, but she was able to hide the true extent of her pain from those around her. This suggests that transparency is not always a reliable indicator of someone's mental or emotional state. Actionable steps. Be aware of the limitations of transparency in human interactions, especially when dealing with people who are experiencing emotional pain or distress. Look for signs that someone might be struggling, such as changes in behavior or mood, even if they appear to be transparent and open about their feelings. Chapter 5, Lessons from a Tortilla. In Chapter 5, Gladwell tells the story of a group of CIA officers who failed to recognize the significance of a message on a tortilla chip bag, which contained valuable information about a terrorist plot. He uses this example to illustrate the concept of contextualization and how it can influence our perception and interpretation of information. Key insights. Contextualization refers to the process of interpreting information based on its surrounding context. In the case of the tortilla chip bag, the CIA officers failed to contextualize the message, as they were not familiar with the cultural significance of the brand of chips. This led them to overlook valuable information and miss an opportunity to prevent a terrorist attack. Actionable steps. Be aware of the importance of contextualization in interpreting information, especially when dealing with people from different cultural backgrounds or contexts. Look for clues that might help you understand the context surrounding the information, such as cultural symbols or references. When interpreting information, try to put yourself in the shoes of the person who created it, and consider their context and perspective. Chapter 6, Case Study, The Boy in the Shower. In Chapter 6, Gladwell uses the case of the Penn State child abuse scandal to illustrate how people can be deceived by the appearance of authority and expertise. He argues that our tendency to defer to authority figures can lead us to overlook warning signs and red flags, even when they are right in front of us. Key insights. Authority and expertise can be deceptive, as people who hold positions of power or influence can abuse that power and mislead others. In the case of the Penn State scandal, the football coach and other authority figures were able to conceal the abuse of a young boy, despite numerous warning signs and indications that something was wrong. This suggests that our tendency to defer to authority can be dangerous, as it can lead us to overlook the evidence in front of us. Actionable steps. Be aware of the potential for abuse of authority and expertise, and don't assume that someone who holds a position of power or influence is always acting in your best interests. Look for warning signs and red flags, even if they are being dismissed or overlooked by people in positions of authority. When making decisions or evaluating information, consider multiple sources of information and perspectives, rather than relying solely on the opinions of authority figures. Context and examples. In Chapter 4, Gladwell uses the example of Sylvia Plath to illustrate the limitations of transparency in human interactions. Plath was a successful poet who struggled with mental illness and ultimately committed suicide. Gladwell argues that despite Plath's apparent transparency and openness about her struggles, she was able to hide the true extent of her pain from those around her. This highlights the complexity of human emotions and the limitations of transparency in understanding someone's mental or emotional state. In Chapter 5, Gladwell uses the example of the tortilla chip bag to illustrate the concept of contextualization and how it can influence our perception and interpretation of information. The CIA officers who failed to recognize the significance of the message on the chip bag were not familiar with the cultural context surrounding the brand of chips, which led them to overlook valuable information. This highlights the importance of understanding the context in which information is created and transmitted, especially when dealing with people from different cultural backgrounds or contexts. In Chapter 6, Gladwell uses the Penn State child abuse scandal to illustrate how people can be deceived by the appearance of authority and expertise. Despite numerous warning signs and indications that something was wrong, the football coach and other authority figures were able to conceal the abuse of a young boy. This highlights the danger of blindly deferring to authority figures and the importance of considering multiple sources of information and perspectives. Chapter 7, Case Study: The Fraternity Party. In Chapter 7, Gladwell uses the case of a sexual assault that occurred at a fraternity party at Stanford University in 2015 to illustrate the concept of coupling. He argues that certain behaviors and attitudes are inherently linked and cannot be understood or addressed in isolation. Key insights: coupling refers to the idea that certain behaviors and attitudes are inherently linked and cannot be understood or addressed in isolation. In the case of the fraternity party, the sexual assault was coupled with a culture of heavy drinking and partying, as well as a lack of accountability and consequences for harmful behavior. This suggests that addressing sexual assault requires addressing the underlying cultural factors that contribute to it. Actionable steps: be aware of the cultural factors that contribute to harmful behavior, such as heavy drinking or a lack of accountability and consequences. Address these underlying cultural factors in order to prevent harmful behavior from occurring in the first place. When dealing with issues of sexual assault or harassment, recognize the link between behavior and cultural factors, and work to address both simultaneously. Chapter 8, Case Study: The Arrest of Sandra Bland. In Chapter 8, Gladwell returns to the case of Sandra Bland to illustrate how minor violations can lead to major consequences when there is a power imbalance in a human interaction. He argues that the power dynamics between police officers and civilians can create a dangerous and unequal playing field. Key insights: power dynamics can create a dangerous and unequal playing field in human interactions, especially when there is a power imbalance between the parties involved. In the case of Sandra Bland, a minor traffic violation escalated into a violent confrontation with a police officer, highlighting the potential for abuse of power in these interactions. This suggests that reforming law enforcement practices and addressing power imbalances is essential to preventing future tragedies. Actionable steps: be aware of the power dynamics at play in human interactions, and recognize the potential for abuse of power when there is a power imbalance between the parties involved. Advocate for reform of law enforcement practices that perpetuate these power imbalances and lead to abuse of power. When interacting with others, be mindful of your own position of power and strive to create an equal and respectful playing field. Chapter 9, Case Study: Sylvia Plath. In Chapter 9, Gladwell returns to the case of Sylvia Plath to illustrate how people's behaviors can be influenced by the expectations of others. He argues that people often conform to social expectations, even when those expectations are harmful or counterproductive. Key insights: social expectations can influence people's behavior and decisions, even when those expectations are harmful or counterproductive. In the case of Sylvia Plath, she felt pressure to conform to traditional gender roles and expectations, which contributed to her struggles with mental illness. This suggests that addressing harmful social expectations is essential to creating a more equitable and healthy society. Actionable steps: be aware of the social expectations that influence your own behavior and decisions, and recognize the potential for harmful or counterproductive expectations to hold you back. Challenge harmful social expectations and advocate for a more equitable and healthy society. When interacting with others, be mindful of the social expectations that might be influencing their behavior, and work to create an environment that is supportive and encouraging. Context and examples. In Chapter 7, Gladwell uses the case of the sexual assault at the fraternity party to illustrate the concept of coupling and the link between behavior and cultural factors. He argues that addressing sexual assault requires addressing the underlying cultural factors that contribute to it, such as heavy drinking or a lack of accountability and consequences. This highlights the importance of creating a culture that promotes healthy and respectful behavior, rather than just addressing individual instances of harm. In Chapter 8, Gladwell returns to the case of Sandra Bland to illustrate the dangers of power imbalances in human interactions. He argues that the power dynamics between police officers and civilians can create a dangerous and unequal playing field, and that reforming law enforcement practices is essential to preventing future tragedies. This highlights the need to address systemic issues that perpetuate power imbalances and lead to abuse of power. In Chapter 9, Gladwell returns to the case of Sylvia Plath to illustrate the influence of social expectations on behavior and decision-making. He argues that harmful or counterproductive social expectations can hold people back and contribute to mental health struggles. This highlights the importance of challenging harmful social expectations and advocating for a more equitable and healthy society. Chapter 10, Case Study, The Queen of Cuba. In Chapter 10, Gladwell tells the story of Marita Lawrence, a German-American woman who was recruited by the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro. He uses Lawrence's story to illustrate the concept of default to truth and how it can lead to dangerous misunderstandings in human interactions. Key insights. Default to truth refers to the idea that people tend to assume that others are telling the truth, unless there is evidence to suggest otherwise. In the case of Marita Lawrence, she was recruited by the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro, but ultimately ended up having a romantic relationship with him instead. This highlights the potential for misunderstandings and misinterpretations when people default to truth in their interactions with others. Actionable steps. Be aware of the potential for misunderstandings and misinterpretations when defaulting to truth in human interactions. Look for evidence that might contradict someone's story or behavior, and don't assume that they are telling the truth without verification. When negotiating with others, be prepared to walk away if you feel that there are discrepancies or inconsistencies in their story. Chapter 11, Case Study, The Friends Fallacy. In Chapter 11, Gladwell uses the example of the TV show Friends to illustrate the concept of transparency illusion and how it can lead to unrealistic expectations in human relationships. Key insights. Transparency illusion refers to the idea that people tend to overestimate their ability to read others' thoughts, feelings, and intentions. In the case of Friends, the characters were able to read each other's minds and anticipate each other's needs and desires, creating an unrealistic portrayal of human relationships. This highlights the potential for unrealistic expectations and misunderstandings when people assume that they can read others' minds. Actionable steps. Be aware of the limitations of transparency in human relationships and recognize that you may not always be able to accurately read others' thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Communicate clearly and openly with others, rather than relying on assumptions or mind reading. When interpreting others' behavior or actions, be aware of the potential for misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Chapter 12, Case Study, The Enron Scandal. In Chapter 12, Gladwell uses the Enron scandal to illustrate the concept of mismatch and how it can lead to catastrophic outcomes in human interactions. He argues that when people are operating under different assumptions and expectations, the results can be disastrous. Key insights. Mismatch refers to the idea that when people are operating under different assumptions and expectations, the results can be catastrophic. In the case of Enron, the company's leaders were operating under a different set of assumptions and expectations than the rest of the company, which led to a culture of deception and fraud. This highlights the potential for catastrophic outcomes when there is a mismatch in assumptions and expectations in human interactions. Actionable steps. Be aware of the potential for mismatches in assumptions and expectations in human interactions, especially in high-stakes situations. Communicate clearly and openly with others about your assumptions and expectations, and seek to understand theirs as well. When working in a group or team, strive to create a shared understanding of assumptions and expectations in order to prevent misunderstandings and catastrophic outcomes. Context and examples. In Chapter 10, Gladwell uses the story of Marita Lawrence to illustrate the potential for misunderstandings and misinterpretations when defaulting to truth in human interactions. Lawrence's recruitment by the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro ultimately led to a romantic relationship with him, highlighting the potential for dangerous misunderstandings when people assume that others are telling the truth without verification. This highlights the importance of verifying information and looking for evidence that might contradict someone's story or behavior, especially in high-stakes situations. In Chapter 11, Gladwell uses the example of Friends to illustrate the limitations of transparency in human relationships. The characters on the show were able to read each other's minds and anticipate each other's needs and desires, creating an unrealistic portrayal of human relationships. This highlights the potential for unrealistic expectations and misunderstandings when people assume assume that they can read others' minds. Entrepreneurs can apply this insight by communicating clearly and openly with others, rather than relying on assumptions or mind reading, in order to prevent misunderstandings and build stronger relationships. In Chapter 12, Gladwell uses the Enron scandal to illustrate the potential for catastrophic outcomes when there is a mismatch in assumptions and expectations in human interactions. The company's leaders were operating under a different set of assumptions and expectations than the rest of the company, which led to a culture of deception and fraud. This highlights the importance of communicating clearly and openly about assumptions and expectations, and seeking to understand others' assumptions and expectations as well in order to prevent misunderstandings and catastrophic outcomes.